Welcome everybody to the webinar Teardowns to Mansionization, Preserving Community Character. So just a second here. So it's going to be two of us here. Again, I'm Adrian Scott Fine, Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy, and with me is neighborhood activist Shelley Wagers, who will also be plugging in shortly to share her experience with this issue. We're talking about teardowns and mansionization, and when you talk about that, neighborhood battles are brewing between what some consider symbols of excess versus good environmental and preservation planning. So nationally, until recently, the real estate market was more of a buyer's market, more like this, though the LA area has always been a bit immune from this, and teardowns have occurred unabated even during the economic recession. This characterizes more of our real estate market in the kind of Southern California, Los Angeles, or really most of California location, where the location and ground is often worth or perceived to be worth more than the house that occupies it. In Los Angeles, it's referred to as mansionization or as McMansions, but depending on where you are in the country, it also goes as Bigfoots, trophy homes, scrape-offs, starter castles, bash and build, and garage mahals. I personally have been involved in the teardowns issue since around 2002 when I was at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And at that time, we took on the position and took on the issue of teardowns by placing teardowns in historic neighborhoods on America's 11 Most Endangered Places listing. And at the time, we were tracking this nationally, and we did this to draw attention to the growing trend and build awareness on how it was impacting and damaging older and historic neighborhoods in particular across the country, and charting that. So today's webinar, we will set the current context for the teardowns issue from both a national to local context, certainly mostly from a local context. We also want to outline steps to demonstrate how to make an effective case for this issue and why your community should do something about teardowns and mansionization. And then lastly, we'll identify some of the tools being used to address this challenge, specifically focus on Los Angeles, and ways to build community and political support to ensure they are adopted and hopefully successfully implemented. So just so that we're all on the same page, let's start by defining teardowns. As, quote, the practice of purchasing a home on a lot, demolishing it, and most often building a new, larger house in its place, usually 3 times the size of what was there before. Mansionization itself is what follows the teardowns in terms of out of scale and context new replacement houses. That again is most often, by this illustration and example, is usually 3 times the size of what was there before. And in general, that works to describe the trend, but what it doesn't do is illustrate the full range in which teardowns are happening and who is doing them. And certainly it varies across the country or even across California in terms of how egregious or successful practices might be. Teardowns and mansionization, without any question, is a controversial and complicated topic. There are no easy answers or a one-size-fits-all approach. From our experience, at the heart of it all, it's about losing historic architecture. But it's really so much more than that. It's also about private property rights. It's about smart growth. It's certainly about affordable housing, environmental issues, as well as sustainability. But it's also about economics and tax base, demographic shifts, and ever-changing housing preferences. But from our perspective, and the easiest way to kind of boil this down, it's about losing community character and neighborhood livability. And I think on those 2 points alone, many communities have been successful in resonating around this issue to try to affect real change. Since I first became involved in this issue in the early 2000s, there are several things as being, I believe, consistent facts associated with teardowns, and just 3 of those I'll throw out. One is that it's not an entirely new trend. Certainly, we've been dealing with this as a practice since the early 1990s. However, it is occurring and has been occurring specifically in the Los Angeles area more and more in the older and historic close-in neighborhoods. In a majority of instances, teardowns are being done by developers or speculative builders, leaving existing residents to feel that they've lost control of their neighborhood. It's become a very lucrative business with middleman brokers who specialize in assembling an inventory of properties available as teardowns versus homeowners doing this. It does happen that way, but most of it is a spec building driven trend. And lastly, places where we're seeing lots of teardowns are in fast-growing, desirable neighborhoods, centrally located outside major urban centers. Usually they're places where there's not a lot of vacant land in which to build, good public transit nearby, good schools, other public and scenic amenities that the people want to be in these neighborhoods. The reason why teardowns have been happening is it's an overvalued real estate market where essentially builders look for what they consider undervalued properties in which they can buy, demolish, and rebuild, making a profit. It's something that we coined some time ago in terms of the rule of three. You build it 3 times bigger than what was there before and expect a return on investment by threefold as well. And often that does pan out, although there's some signs that maybe that's not so likely in the future, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. The other thing is not all teardowns are the same. Sometimes the house plan for demolition is individually significant. However, in our experience, most cases, it may just be a contributing structure to a great neighborhood. In most instances, that neighborhood does not have any type of historic designation or specific overlay zoning that protects it, so it's vulnerable to this type of issue. And although most often the case, it's also not always the case where small homes are being replaced by a significant larger house either. It may just be a desire to build something new and different that doesn't always fit, I think, as you can see by this example in a kind of a 20s neighborhood. Though following the loss of the house results in replacement houses also vary greatly through overall design, material, scale, which prompts the need to talk further about ways to encourage good design in a community. I also want to illustrate different scenarios we've seen that generally fall under the teardowns umbrella. The first is this classic teardown, where a house in a historic neighborhood is torn down and replaced with something, again, roughly 3 times the size of the previous structure, as you can see on both sides of this smaller house. With their volume, scale, and massing, these new structures loom over their neighbors and break the established building patterns of the area. I want to quickly illustrate this and just kind of a typical pro forma of what you might see in a neighborhood. And let's just look at this an example. Typical house, smaller house, or what people may be perceiving as a smaller house, sells for $650,000. Again, the idea that you're going to demolish it and build something 3 times the size of what was there, and build a house maybe 6,000 square feet in size. You see how this plays out in terms of both physically, but also where they look at the profit margin in terms of this kind of trend. And it is a domino effect that once a neighborhood is deemed viable for teardowns, you see this continuing on right down the path in terms of really changing and destroying the character of a neighborhood. And it no longer what we call holds together in terms of being maybe even considered as a historic neighborhood for designation or otherwise in the future as this plays out. The other types of de facto teardowns are also places that have been so extensively remodeled through the same kind of trend that they're effectively teardowns, or what some places call them pop-tops. And we don't see a lot of this in Los Angeles, but it is happening to some degree. So that's another nuance of this trend. Or we see things like this, where you may not lose the historic house, but you certainly lose what it's about when it gets becomes completely encapsulated in something new. Also, another part of this is that looks can be deceiving, and people will always find the loopholes and exploit them in the policies, and that certainly happened in Los Angeles and across the country. And this is about the issue of defining your definition of demolition, where someone will say, this is actually remodeling. This looks like a pretty clear demolition to us. And so that's the other piece of this, is having clear policies on that. So this is a typical teardown target, I would say, in Los Angeles. Nice, smaller house, big lot. And as I think you'll see by this example, this is again how a builder or a developer looks at this. Big lot, this is undervalued, and ripe, again, for doing a teardown. So we see both kind of our 20s, 30s houses being prone to this, as well as mid-century modern homes throughout the city. The other big issue that I think Shelley's group and others have really effectively made is that teardowns destroy more than houses. Neighborhood livability is diminished as trees are removed, backyards are eliminated, and sunlight is blocked. And the other big issue with this is privacy. Again, with residents feeling as though they've lost control of their neighborhood that they once loved, and they don't even have privacy within their backyards. It's also an affordable housing issue too, as teardowns alter a community's economic and social environment. Expensive, newer, and larger houses can cause, and often are causing, assessments to increase in the neighborhood and price out moderate and fixed income residents. And as a trend, and as this can quickly continue and spill over into other neighborhoods, you'll see other neighborhoods that experience the tear down issue as well, and their prices escalate at a very quick level that previously never would have been viable. Again, destroying really important kind of affordable starter houses. Neighborhoods hardest hit by teardowns are also part of the larger issue, with the number of middle-income neighborhoods are shrinking nationwide faster than the number of middle-income families. So it's a supply-demand issue. And again, this whole idea, the concept and idea of the starter house, which is kind of a fundamental American dream, it's no longer attainable for many. And certainly markets like San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and on. In LA, that means you need at least $500,000 and up to even start thinking about entering the housing market. And teardowns, again, accelerate the pricing in a way that makes that unattainable for so many. Some communities are also correctly linking teardowns with the loss of affordable housing and starter houses with things like higher demolition fees. It's another kind of backdoor approach to addressing this issue. We may not get the policies in place to control it, but you might create disincentives for it to happen. And some communities often offer linkage fees to every teardown, such as I know at least one community that offers a $10,000 fee for every demolition that goes to a housing trust fund for affordable housing. So there's other ways to look at this, and again, it's multiple tools. In my experience, people generally come at the teardowns and mansionization issue from two perspectives. First is this case. Those are primarily focused on protecting the existing houses. They don't want the houses demolished. Second are those that are more concerned about the new houses and whether or not they fit in with the character of the neighborhood. Sometimes I think people are concerned about both aspects equally, but depending on where you fall, there will definitely be different approaches or tools to pursue. Again, it's usually a combination of tools that we talk about. So let's start with the first premise. These are the people that care about, they don't want the buildings demolished. Some policies are intended to slow the amount of teardown activity or put up hurdles where the older homes will be protected, if not long-term, at least temporarily. I think this is where we see things like historic district designation. So the image you see right now is from another community that tracked just for 1 year the number of teardowns, demolition permits that were happening across the city. So those are all the red dots. Everything in yellow are their designated local historic districts where there's some type of design review mechanism in place. And you'll see most of the teardowns are happening outside of those historic districts, or what we have in Los Angeles, HPOZs, or historic preservation overlay zones. So that's one way, to understand how much of an issue it is in your community, but also to understand the type of tools. And again, designation is more of a protecting what's there now. And we have neighborhoods that certainly pursued this, like Homeby Westwood, worked very hard for a very long period of time to try to get an HPOZ for their neighborhood. And unfortunately, they were not successful, and that just recently happened. The flip side, and the good news, Carthay Square, who worked over a 10-year period to get an HPOZ, again, in direct response to mansionization and teardowns, they were successful and are the latest of the HPOZs to achieve that status. So it can happen, but it's a specific tool to protect places. So if we do the other argument in terms of people that are concerned more about the new replacement homes or mansionization, again, other tools are geared more towards influencing the way in which replacement houses may or may not be built. So we see things like conservation districts, pattern books, and a lot of focus, certainly in Los Angeles, on revamping the zoning to reflect the existing context of a neighborhood. Places all over are tweaking standards for floor area ratio, setback and open space standards, height standards, lot coverage, and doing things like giving bonuses for front porches or restricting garages to the rear to avoid what some call the snout house effect, all toward reaching a context-sensitive, design approach for a neighborhood. It doesn't prevent demolitions, but it's trying to get a better product. Some other communities are doing this in a way to try to incentivize people to do additions. So they maybe lower building fees or permitting fees to try encourage and steer them to do that as well. So there's, again, lots of approaches that can be used. In LA, it's been a combination of both of these approaches, both from trying to protect the existing as well as trying to get a better product. Though I would say mostly it's on the latter and trying to get better results for the new replacement houses. And while there doesn't, again, appear to be a single tool out there that solves the overall problem, it's rather a combination of strategies that works the most effectively, from voluntary to regulatory to incentive-based planning approaches. So, and we'll touch on some of those as we go further through this presentation. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road on this issue, in trying to influence teardowns and mansionization in a meaningful way. It will happen at the local level. And despite the best efforts of advocacy and long-term efforts of this and burnout, it's often a multi-year, highly political charged process where we may have little influence and policies can get watered down and weakened before they become enacted. And I think that's the harsh reality that is very much linked to this particular issue. The teardown and mansionization problem in the greater Los Angeles area is broad in scope, has impacted nearby communities, including Beverly Hills, Arcadia, San Marino, Santa Monica, and more. Each community and municipal jurisdiction, including Los Angeles, has approached the problem differently. And so for the purposes of this webinar and talking about tools and strategies, we will be focusing on the Los Angeles experience, but here before you right now is what Pasadena is doing. They're very much in the thick of this right now, have taken steps, and I would say they're midway through this process in trying to enact real measures to address mansionization there. So at this point, I want to introduce you to Shelley Wagers. She's a homeowner, a community activist, and what I would say is a top-notch on-the-job trained expert in the Los Angeles mansionization issue. And for more than a decade, she and other residents in the Beverly Grove neighborhood have worked hard to establish a model approach to curb and slow down teardowns. Most recently, Shelley and I have been working together and advocating for amended baseline mansionization and hillside ordinances in Los Angeles, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's nearly in place and were voted on in unanimous support last week by City Council, so this is good timing that we're talking about that to actually have a success story to share. This amendment process from start to finish this month has been a nearly 3-year vigilant process, so it takes time for sure. So with Shelley, we're gonna talk about these two tools and LA's new single-family variation zones shortly in detail. We're going to do this sort of in chronological order, starting with the Beverly Grove Residential Floor Area Ordinance, which was passed in 2013, with an effort that began in 2004, takes time, followed by the city's baseline mansionization and hillside ordinances, which initially passed in 2008 and 11, and are now being amended and overhauled in 2017. And lastly, we'll discuss, again, the new single-family variation zones, which are currently being implemented initially in about 20 neighborhoods. We're going to do this part in a Q&A interview format, in part with me asking Shelley a series of questions through an informal discussion. Here again is Shelley with Councilman Paul Kretz, who's really been the champion and leader for the teardowns mansionization in Los Angeles. So the images you're going to see throughout this discussion illustrate various examples of the issue in Los Angeles and in particular in Shelley's neighborhood of Beverly Grove. But let me introduce and have Shelley join in here and say hello.
Yes, good day. Glad to be here.
And let me start by asking Shelley how she came to this issue as a homeowner that saw a problem needing to be fixed. What made you want to do something about teardowns and mansionization? And most importantly, I think for everyone else, how did you even get started?
The neighborhood where I live, Beverly Grove, abuts Beverly Hills, and I could see as early as 2004 that mansionization was really starting to tear up some of the nearby neighborhoods. And I felt it would be a matter of time, and not very much time at that, before it simply jumped the border. So I put heads together with a couple of like-minded neighbors. We did initially just a postcard survey to see if people had any awareness or any feelings on the subject. Then we followed up with a small neighborhood meeting, and we built it out from there.
Great. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the Beverly Grove neighborhood in particular, why it is special, and what was happening there in the mid-2000s in terms of the real estate market, and also share a little bit about how No More McMansions in Los Angeles got its start?
Okay, well, the designation Beverly Grove generally applies to a somewhat broader area. It's roughly between Beverly Center and the old farmers market of the Grove, for those who know it. It was indeed originally an orange grove that was rezoned for development. With respect to the Beverly Grove RFA overlay zone, that applies to 20 blocks of single-family properties on 5 contiguous streets, and it's pretty consistent. Most of the houses were built in the 1920s, many Spanish style, some Norman, a few storybook. The average home size of the older homes are a little over 2,000 square feet, and a very central location besides major shopping and restaurants, very close to LA County Museum of Art, Cedars-Sinai, so lots of amenities and a very attractive location. Our organization was really kind of put together on the fly with as little structure as necessary, just enough to make sure that we could have a greater presence, that we could handle outreach, that we had some vehicles for communication, principally our website, which has been very, very helpful. By the way, you may want to make a note of that address because I'm not sure how much longer it will be there. And in addition to a lot of neighborhood-specific stuff, there are some general arguments on the subject which you will probably be encountering yourself, and you may want to give that a look. So we did that and had a Facebook page as well, and hit the streets.
So we've talked about this before, but what were realtors telling you about home values and either the benefits or the cons of mansionization, and specifically about living next door to a McMansion?
Local realtors suggested that the big box brings down the value of its nearest neighbor by something between $50,000 and $100,000. And I'm sure you will all find that regulation always raises the economic issue. The argument that I make is that mansionization makes a quick buck for a speculator, but it's at someone else's expense. Effective regulation, by contrast, promotes stable, long-term property values across an entire community.
And there's been a number of recent articles that have come out that are kind of showing this and demonstrating that the values aren't everything that is touted to be in terms of mansionization.
Yes, absolutely. And moreover, because it's essentially, as you already indicated, a speculative venture, it is subject to the kinds of gyrations that you have with any bubble. Mm-hmm. And the area of Arcadia was just recently profiled in the LA Times as having a lot of white elephant houses, McMansions, that are now sitting empty.
And one thing to add to this, I would say, in my experience, that we often get, and anybody that's dealing with this issue, you get the argument about why should somebody be penalized from selling their house for the highest value as a tear down. And I think one issue with that is they're leaving the neighborhood, they're cashing out. And so when we're talking about managing teardowns, it's about a long-term strategy for a neighborhood, not just a short-term gain for an individual property owner. And that's the problem, I think, for a lot of this, is that everyone is just thinking about what they can gain on their own property and maybe leaving it behind, and what comes next isn't necessarily what the rest of the people that are still in the neighborhood want.
Right. If I might add, I think that one thing that gets overlooked is that the purpose of zoning is not to maximize short-term profit and incentivize speculation. The purpose of zoning is to promote compatible development over a relatively longer time frame.
So you obviously got involved in this for a reason. What's your personal experience with teardowns, and how has it affected your own personal livability?
Well, I guess one thing I would say, sort of in my defense, is that I did get involved in this before it really was on my doorstep in any sense. However, this is a photo of the house that abuts my property from behind, from the street behind us. And as you can see, it looms. So I guess what I would say is I can still eat and sleep and enjoy life, but I definitely feel hemmed in a way that I didn't before. The people are actually nicer than the house. I think the real difference is that they just see a house. They don't see a house as part of a neighborhood.
Right, and this gets at the heart of the issue, where a lot of the new replacement homes just completely envelop and take over the entire lot, versus respecting kind of setbacks and scale and massing that traditionally you're finding in older neighborhoods. So it's a hard fit when you're filling in almost an entire lot size, that you get these kinds of things where you feel like someone next door is now looking right into your bedroom window, and requires for a lot of people that they're having to plant hedges and all kinds of things that typically would never have been a concern in the past. In 2006, then City Council member Jack Weiss introduced and secured interim control ordinance, or a moratorium for Beverly Grove, that essentially put the brakes on teardowns in the neighborhood for a period up to 2 years. Shelley, how were you able to gain the political support for this initial step?
The truth is, it was a tough sale because he was not inherently sympathetic, but we did manage to present some pretty compelling evidence. We started by doing a petition of our own, and then he followed up, as I thought was entirely appropriate, with his own survey. And both of those undertakings showed very broad support for limits on home size and stopping the mansionization.
Just a follow-up on that, how did you approach Councilman Weiss at the time in making your case for this?
Well, we actually began first by petitioning and then going to him with the petition. Well, actually, I believe that one of his planning deputies had spoken with us at the very first go-round and had suggested that, which proved to be fruitful.
Okay. So following the initial adoption of the interim control ordinance, again, this is what we're seeing in a lot of communities, that this is the initial step to put the brakes or slow down teardowns and have some cooling off period of time to kind of think through a strategy. But in the case of Beverly Grove, it took another 7 years before you ultimately were successful in passing the Beverly Grove residential floor area ordinance. I guess a couple of questions. Why did it take so long, and how can that be helpful, I think, for others that are listening in? But also, how did you keep the pressure on? How did you keep people motivated during that long period of time that ultimately you were successful?
Right. Well, the first question really kind of comes down to individuals, as things often do. The council member who got the ICO had no real commitment to the issue. So he got us pretty much the least that he could get away with. And at that point, shrugged and walked away. We were basically stymied until he was replaced by our current council member, Paul Koritz, who was, I think, inherently very simpatico, in addition to which, when he campaigned for office, he went door to door and he got an earful. And as he will tell it, heard over and over from residents that they wanted the mansionization stopped. So he got it. Once he sort of got his bearings, he dug in, and it was a long haul. I think, well, probably for a number of reasons, but two big ones being that we had to contend both with some very active opposition and with the slow grind of bureaucracy, including budget problems. Fortunately, Councilmember Koretz served on the budget committee, and he absolutely hammered that one and insisted on the funding that was needed for staffing to make this go forward.
So we're going to shortly get into what specifically the Beverly Grove RFA ordinance does, but just a follow-up to that is, how did you motivate residents to do something and become engaged and essentially fight City Hall in this particular case, given it's often so hard to get people to take action and be involved in something in a meaningful way for a sustained period of time? I'm just curious about the whole grassroots support of how you went about doing that.
Part of it, I have no idea. I think it's dumb luck. But I would say that as an issue, mansionization, has one thing going for it, which is it really hits home. It's, you know, the classic definition of something that is close to home. Beyond that, I would say that in our case, once we got the support of Councilmember Koretz, people could see a path. And it was something that I could present as difficult but possible. I won't ask anybody to chase a lost cause, but pursuing a stretch goal, that's worth a shot. And people saw that there was a possibility, and we had some real support at City Hall and a real shot at getting it done. So a lot of people poured a tremendous amount of energy into this.
Another thing I've seen in neighborhoods that I think have been effective in trying to, get your foot in the door in City Hall and take for them to take the issue seriously, especially in the early days of a mansionization issue in a community, is that some neighborhoods have been very good in quantifying the problem. So not only are they tracking, the demolition permits, they're taking lots of before and after photos, they're putting up signage in the yards, which certainly you all have done as well, to make it visible so that it's hard for someone to act like it's not a big problem. Especially if you've got some unfortunate, egregious examples of where, especially maybe an important building was lost, or some of the really poorly designed replacement housing. That's often been very effective, those visuals, and making your case so that you can get them to take this seriously and hopefully work with you to come up with a strategy.
Right. We've even had examples where a decision maker would look at a photo and gasp. The impact was absolutely irrefutable.
Right, and you're obviously seeing lots of those images through this presentation, but that's part of the strategy. It's a very visual issue, and as Shelley said, it hits home. So when you've got one of these right next door to you or across the street, it sometimes motivates people in ways that otherwise they wouldn't do anything. So let's get at specifics, because I think a lot of people want to know about what this tool does. So the Beverly Grove Residential Floor Area Ordinance and a slightly earlier one in Studio City have become essentially the models for the city of this approach. There's certainly other neighborhoods that after this that really clamored and wanted the same tool. So can we go through this and describe a little bit what it does exactly and the key components that make it effective?
Right. The two RFAs are actually very different. The people in Studio City blazed the trail, and they have got the scars to show for it. Initially, we planned to use their ordinance as a template, but as we got into it, we saw that by necessity, theirs ended up being very, very complicated. And the goal for our ordinance was to have something very simple, very straightforward, and very enforceable. This is really, really important. What we went for, and happily what we got, was an ordinance that brought the base floor area ratio down to size.
And can you, for the group, can you just explain floor area ratio?
Absolutely. Most communities regulate the size of most kinds of structures, whether they're residential, commercial, industrial, whatever, by the ratio, that is the size of the structure compared to the size of the lot. So it's a fairly straightforward number, and in the city of Los Angeles, it has been a very, very liberal number, so we ratcheted that down. We also dealt with the two principal categories of loophole in the existing ordinance, and those are the exemptions for square footage that simply wasn't counted in the calculation, and bonuses, which we eliminated entirely except for one that we devised ourselves. The big red flag was attached garages for reasons that I think Adrian has articulated very well. It very much disrupts the look and feel of the neighborhood. It adds hundreds of square feet of bloat. It eliminates the buffer of the driveway. It usually destroys mature street trees. And we really, really wanted to take aim at that. So we made the detached garage at the back of the lot the only way to get bonus square footage. So if you wanted to have an attached garage, you could do it, but you would end up with a total smaller structure than if you had a detached garage and got yourself the bonus. It was pretty compelling.
So the tool has been in place for nearly 4 years. My question is, how well is it working? Are residents generally happy with the results? Have teardowns stopped altogether in your neighborhood, or are you just getting much better outcomes in terms of the scale and character of the new replacement homes?
Well, I will say that our goal was never to preserve every single house in the neighborhood. The distinction that you made, I think, is an important one in terms of that. What we have seen is that, contrary to the scare tactics and the distortions and so forth of the opposition, the market in the Beverly Grove does remain robust. Houses are being sold, houses are being renovated, and in some cases houses are being torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. Some of them, say the one that's in the center of this photo, conform to the ordinance. Now, it may not be something that will get an architecture prize, but it definitely is a major improvement over the kind of big box mass that has been driving people crazy from one end of the country to the other, and you will see that it has the precious driveway there. So the houses that conform fit in pretty well. But there is a pipeline, and in Los Angeles, it's a long pipeline, and the developers, as they will do, really stuffed that pipeline before the new ordinance took effect. So there have absolutely been things built since the day the ink dried that do not conform because their permits simply predate the ordinance. And it can be hard for people to understand and hard for people to accept, but that's a reality that you will almost deal with anywhere you go. It's simply not a magic wand. It's a very valuable tool.
A follow-up question to that. You said, rightly so, that the motivation here was mostly about to ensure you had better replacement homes.
Right.
Not entirely to preserve what was there in place. Was that ever a consideration as you started in terms of thinking about historic preservation overlay zoning? And what was the thought process you went through to either decide not to do that, or for what reason?
For what it's worth, this is something that people will want to be thinking about. Initially, it was our aim to get historic preservation overlay zone, but it was very clear very early that that was simply radioactive in our neighborhood. And sometimes you just have to deal with the realities. The historic zones have tremendous value, but they have one, I would say, pervasive problem, which is it's always easy to demagogue anything that has to do with style or taste or design and make it sound as though you will not be able to pick out your own draperies. You are going to have somebody hanging all over you, et cetera, et cetera. The opposition in our area very effectively played this, and rather than swim that hard against the tide, we felt that we would be better served by at least getting a spoke, in the wheel and stopping the destruction of our neighborhood. One of the arguments that I made early and often was that the design characteristics that you don't like will bother you a lot less when the house is 2/3 the size of what you're looking at now. And a lot of the worst of them, of course, simply disappear because there are different incentives.
And I would just add to that, I think that's right. In terms of neighborhoods that are going through this process and deciding what to do, they go through this decision-making process and which approach is right for them. And the reality, especially in a place like Los Angeles, where each and every HPOZ is very staff and volunteer labor intensive, and it takes a long time to get through the process, and you still might not be successful. It's not the right approach for every neighborhood. That's why we have spent so much time focused on these other policies and tools in terms of a bigger bang for the buck to try to address this issue and, again, manage growth and change in these neighborhoods so it's not destroying them, but it may not be like the pristine approach that you will find more associated with becoming an HPOZ or a local historic district. So is there anything I've missed or anything you'd like to share about your Beverly Grove experience that people should understand and know about?
I guess I would say a couple of things. One is it's hard to overstate the value of cohesion. The developers have an inside track, very much so in Los Angeles, and probably to a pretty good extent almost everywhere. Activists, really all we have is our numbers. So you need to really stay on top of that and work very, very hard to keep folks on the same page. The other thing that I would mention, and I hesitate because it sounds a little sanctimonious or maybe a little self-congratulatory, but boy, you want to keep to the high road because it's going to take a while. And there are going to be a lot of times when it's very, very tempting either to vent or to lash out or whatever. You want to establish relationships of trust and respect to the greatest extent that you can. As an example, I would say that there were times when there was kind of a lull and they wanted to go picket the office of our council member and, carrying signs that said ugly things about him. And, it was like, you can always get ugly later. Never go too quickly to the nuclear option or whatever the equivalent is. And obviously, of course, outreach is very, very important. We can't overstate as well the value of the support that we've had, for example, from the Los Angeles Conservancy as well as other organizations.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that it's easy to kind of jump to the blame game. And the truth is that both from elected officials to planners and all these cities have a lot on their plate already, and they're just barely keeping their head above water in many cases. And I think especially from planning, we've actually had really, especially on the baseline mansionization, which is what we're going to shift to in a second here, I think a very good relationship with them. And they've worked hard to try to meet the concerns that we've all expressed and come up with a nice balanced approach, but I've been very thoughtful in doing that. So at this point, we're going to shift. Shelley and I are going to talk more about LA's baseline mansionization hillside ordinances. We may fall into the speak of calling them the BMO, BHO. That's kind of our language at this point. So we'll try to talk in normal terms. We're going to talk about their origins, how they first came about, but most specifically the most recent effort to amend and overhaul them in an attempt to close long-standing loopholes and address significant shortcomings and failures in the ordinances. I'll start by first explaining, and you see this very, blast from the past from 2008, kind of blurry images, explaining the BMO, BHO ordinances and their passage in 2008 initially. That was the baseline Mansionization ordinance. And then in 2011 for the baseline Hillside ordinance. It started on May 6, 2008, when the city passed the first of these ordinances as a citywide measure as an attempt to control Mansionization. And in many ways, it was very much focused on reducing the floor area ratio and dealing with lots of different aspects to this. But this was the first time that Los Angeles really entered the fray in terms of Mansionization. Previously, the city did not regulate oversized homes in any way, specifically in terms of how this impacts neighborhoods and the environment. So this has been an evolution of thought and working on this issue from the city of Los Angeles. The 2008 BMO and subsequent 2011 BHO ordinances called for special rules for residential hillside development. That was more than 2 years in the public process and debate. Before their ultimate passage, a number of building industry officials and real estate professionals testified and lobbied hard against these ordinances. So I would turn to Shelley again here. I wasn't around at that time. Many have argued that these initial BMO, BHO ordinances were watered down at the last minute to make them more palatable to secure political support and votes, which is not something that's uncommon to this issue or a lot of policy issues, especially around planning. Things get slipped in at the very last minute and you have to live with some things. First of all, do you agree with that in terms of the 2008-2011 BMO, BHO and process and how, in terms of how that unfolded?
Yes, I do. I agree, absolutely. It was not a pretty picture. I guess the takeaway from that is, keep the champagne on ice because it ain't over till it's over. It was so bad that one of the key members of the City Planning Commission ended up leaving the commission. It is said largely in disgust. Another member of the commission told me years later that when he looked back, he had a lot of regret over the way that played out.
Right, which speaks to you might not get exactly what you want, especially the first time around, and that you need to keep kind of chipping away and tweaking at this and testing it out to show that what they passed or what you passed might not be as effective as you would like, and then demonstrating that again and quantifying that so you can have another bite at the apple. And it took a long time in Los Angeles, but nearly 10 years later, we finally got that. So let's flash forward to May 2014 when a city council motion, again with our councilman Paul Koretz, was passed to revisit the BMO and the BHO to address these core problems that Shelley and other residents were continuing to point out as being problems and failures in the ordinances. A few provisions in the baseline ordinances, including exemptions and design bonuses, actually encourage the kind of out-of-scale homes that the ordinances were designed to prevent. So I go back to Shelley. Lots of images of Shelley for you all, so you have a sense of who's talking. So what do you think were the main problems with the initial BMO, BHO ordinances? We've said that they were watered down. What didn't work?
It was essentially what I had just finished contending with in getting the overlay for our neighborhood. The base floor area ratio, that's the principal determinant of the size of the house, it was simply too liberal, too big. In addition, there were bonuses for things like setback of the second story, articulation at the front, and the most mind-numbing of all being what they called green materials and practices, the idea that if you had bamboo flooring that somehow more than offset the impact to the environment of adding a ton of space, which of course it doesn't. In addition, we were looking at the exemptions for covered decks, patios, and balconies, an allowance of 100 square feet of double height space that would count only once as space, and of course the reviled attached garages. So to give you a feel for the metrics, on a 6,000 square foot lot, which would be fairly typical for an urban lot in Los Angeles, you would start with your base floor area ratio allowing 3,000 square feet. But by the time you layered on your bonuses, which would be 20% bonuses plus a whole slew of exemptions, you would be near 4,400 square feet of house on a 6,000 square foot lot. And anyone who has lived next to one can tell you that's too much.
So the 2014 motion by City Council was intended to do essentially 4 primary things with the baseline mansionization and hillside ordinances. 1, reevaluate the residential floor area exemptions that Shelley just mentioned. 2, reevaluate design bonuses, which we've also said was a problem. 3, remove the green building bonuses and clear loophole. And lastly, reduce R1 zone residential floor area and allowable size of new residential construction. That was the mandate that came out of the motion in 2014. In response to increased development pressures and public outcry over the mansionization and teardown trend, the city adopted an interim control ordinance in March 2015. And this was initially for roughly 20 older and historic neighborhoods across the city. Many of those were certainly on the west side of the city where you're seeing this happening in numbers. The ICO, or the interim control ordinance, was designed to provide, again, a 2-year cooling off period while the city adopted long-term measures to curtail incompatible development. This included the proposed BMO-BHO amendments. During this cooling off period that is now set to expire later this month, the ICO regulates scale, massing, height, and setbacks of additions and new construction within the initial 20 neighborhoods. Another ICO was later passed that takes in more areas, including parts of the valley, such as Sherman Oaks. So they have a little bit longer period of time to figure out a plan there. The first 20 were essentially the guinea pigs. And while the numbers have changed a little bit, about 15 of those first 20 neighborhoods were on the path to get new type of zoning that would be more context-based. And then 5 of those neighborhoods, which I think has morphed into about 6 now, were on the path to becoming local historic preservation overlay zones. So not all 20 were headed down the same road. So there's a slightly different approach. As a citywide tool, the BMO-BHO amendments, they will close some loopholes in the ordinances to better protect LA's neighborhoods from out-of-scale construction. Certainly, you can see in this image. And it's important to point out that the soon-to-be BMO-BHO ordinances, or updated ones, they are citywide, yet they don't affect everyone. There's a hierarchy in terms of ordinances. For instance, the Beverly Grove residential floor area ordinance and Studio City, those will supersede the BMO-BHO as it's the more detailed, restricted, and specific planning for that neighborhood. The same can be said for a handful of other neighborhoods. The BMO-BHO is essentially a safety net, citywide safety net for the rest of LA's older and historic neighborhoods until they receive more specific planning zones that are customized to their neighborhood and tailored to their neighborhood issues, which most often in LA comes through a community plan adoption process. However, that's a lengthy process, often years in the making, with a backlog of work in city planning. It's a priority right now, but there are neighborhoods that won't see their new type of zoning for some years to come. Until that happens, the BMO-BHO is there to try and manage teardowns and mansionization. Again, provide better tools than what has been placed before. In our experience throughout this 3-year process to, again, adopt substantive amendments to the BMO-BHO, people have spoken passionately on this issue, asking for policy amendments that better helps manage growth so that new homes are, quote, built to scale with one resident stating character counts that defines us and matters in a neighborhood. Others asked, why should developers have the right to run over entire neighborhoods? And another stated, mansionization is a property right gone wrong. this is the sentiment of many people that experience this issue and the way they look at it. So Shelley, once again, you've been effective in getting people to come out on this issue, hearing after hearing, even when we took 3 steps forward and 2 steps back multiple times in this process. How have you been able to do that, and what lessons do you have to offer others listening in that could be helpful?
Oh, again, I have no idea how this actually happened, but I know that it did involve building a team, because certainly I cannot, nor would I want to do everything. So you're going to need people who have skill sets and interests and abilities that are different from yours, and you are going to need to show them some recognition and some appreciation and give them a role. You will need some amount of structure in terms of having your communications tools, certainly. I think one important thing has been, you do not want to wear out your welcome. And I mean by that, resist the impulse to communicate anything that is incidental. In our case, we basically had 2 lines of communication, one which I called the core group of roughly 3 dozen activists who really wanted to stay on top of this and participate and so forth in a quite active way, and then a broader list of several hundred people who could be counted on to send emails and show up when it was time to show up. So you want to make sure that you not only aren't telling people way more than they want to hear, but that you don't get off topic, you don't share your list with other people, you don't let them be sorry that they gave you their email. The other thing that I think is sort of a corollary is not to overamp. An issue isn't necessarily a problem isn't necessarily a crisis isn't a catastrophe. So you want to be measured so that when you do pound the table, people understand there's a reason. As an example, last December, we were quite far along with this. Things were going very well, and then they went suddenly very not well. And it was something that had to be addressed, I mean, immediately, like, you know, fast, 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 fast. And we needed an outpouring, and it needed to be very, very unequivocal. So when I, you know, absolutely raised a ruckus, people jumped in, because it wasn't, oh, that again, oh God, what now? You know, you have to pace yourself.
And what Shelley is referring to in December was essentially, we had a very good plan moving forward in terms of amendments to the BMO-BHO, and in one meeting with the City Council Committee, much of that progress was reversed, inexplainable. And so within a week, we and others and everybody piled on in a very meaningful way, and were able to reverse that and get it back on track.
Right. I would just say, you know, to their credit, Councilmember Koretz, who had sponsored the initial motion and who was writing herd on it all the way through, got it, as did our council president, Herb Wesson, and they took steps that are certainly unprecedented in my experience to get it back on track.
So we won't go over all the details of the BMO-BHO amendments, but one aspect, and Shelley mentioned before, that we did focus on that's worth pointing out, I think it'd be helpful to other communities. Some might think of it as a minor issue, though we believe it has very much larger, very real consequences if not addressed. So it's the issue of garages and how they are counted as part of a new home's overall square footage. This is where you're going to see lots of visuals to help make this point. So we're going to use these images to help illustrate the historic pattern, certainly of LA's older neighborhoods, but I think it's relevant for folks that are chiming in from Beverly Hills and Santa Monica and Arcadia and others. It's very similar. You will see that most of LA's neighborhoods are just defined by rear detached garages and a long driveway separating, you know, one house from another. It's a pattern all over the city. We see this, some bigger houses or some smaller houses, but it's a very distinct pattern of the city. This, again, is the typical teardown scenario that we've been seeing in rebuild throughout the city, which it breaks that pattern with front-loaded attached garages radically changing the look and feel in overall neighborhood. It's not the entire problem with the new homes, but it's a major contributing element. So a long-standing problem with the current BMO-BHO ordinance is, as Shelley mentioned earlier, the exemption for required covered parking, saying you have to provide this, but they're not counting it. And this allows up to 400 square feet of an attached garage to not count as part of the overall residential floor area ratio or calculation. So this issue has been repeatedly raised as a problematic, essentially freebie that's offered and a clear loophole that results in incompatible design impacts to an older neighborhood. More than any other design element, attached garages severely alter and break the pattern, feel, setting, overall character of an older neighborhood. The design emphasis and focus of, again, many new homes built, or the ones that we're seeing throughout Los Angeles, is most often on the garage, not the house itself, or certainly not a pedestrian experience and elements that you would have found in older neighborhoods or older houses within them. At the front of the property, immediately off the street, a front-loaded garage often adds significant bulk and eliminates the buffer of a long driveway and fails to blend in with the existing homes of a 70 to 100-year-old neighborhood. The long driveway, by contrast, is important, as traditionally provided adjacent homeowners with some privacy, some relief, rather than having a new house occupy most of the width of the lot and feeling like they're right up against them. For the past year, we have focused on this aspect and strongly urging the city to simply count the overall square footage of attached garages. It's a simple and straightforward approach. Anyone can still be allowed and have the option to build an attached garage, as this would not foreclose that opportunity. However, it would need to count as part of the overall square footage. So I go back to Shelley. Can you describe the Make Garages Count campaign and how effective it has been for residents to articulate this through public testimony?
Well, maybe what I'll do is mention once again that there is a lot of material that I think is useful on this subject on the website nomoremcmansionsinlosangeles.org. So if this is something you're grappling with, that may be worth your time. The exemption for attached garages is uniquely damaging in all the ways that Adrian has articulated. Again, however, because Los Angeles is such a big city, there are neighborhoods where it is fairly customary, some of the post-war suburban neighborhoods and so forth. So I think it was very important, because we're dealing with a citywide ordinance, not to ask for a ban on the garages, but simply to make the very common sense argument, space is space, count it, and so forth. And we worked very hard to make sure that supporters understood the issue and they could speak to it. And they did, over and over and over. At the hearing sometime back, the city, actually about 6 months ago, the City Planning Commission president, at the conclusion of testimony, his first comment was that the testimony on garages had been overwhelming. Unfortunately, because of a combination of logistical circumstances, we didn't actually get the full measure of reform that we wanted. We essentially got half a loaf. But to stick with the topic of how it worked at the Plum hearing that was held several months back, we fielded about 50 speakers, and every single one hammered that point home. So it's a question of consistency and focus and repetition and being relentless.
So ultimately, what was voted on last week in the Los Angeles City Council is a compromise. But it's a huge improvement over what was there before. And while it's not perfect, the new amended BMO-BHO ordinances are much better than their 2008-2011 predecessors. On the attached garage issue, as Shelley mentioned, we got the half a low for the 200 square feet. So we were able to secure at least half of the square footage, or 200 of the 400 square feet, to be now counted as part of the overall square footage calculation for a new home. We pressed very hard to include all 400 square feet right up until the end. We were hopeful that that might get through, but ultimately it's one of those things where, as Shelley mentioned earlier, you have to kind of assess your political support. And also our champion on this within City Council also had to look at it in terms of where the votes were, and it just wasn't in the cards. So improvement, but we didn't get everything, but that's how it typically goes. Overall, the BMO BHO ordinances are much tighter, and in some cases, we really do believe will hopefully disincentivize future teardowns from even happening in the first place. So hopefully it will protect more houses, but also get better products in terms of replacement houses. I think the point is that residents need to stay involved even after ordinances pass, because most will be interfered with throughout the political process. Ordinances will need to be tested out a bit first so that later you can come back and attempt to address their shortcomings and any potential flaws. Shelley, is there anything else I might have missed around the BMO BHO ordinances that, in the efforts to get them passed, that you'd like to touch upon or helpful to hear from?
I guess I would just say I just a few days ago came across something that was attributed to Confucius, and that is better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. Another way of kind of saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good. We have an ordinance which is massively improved, and it was hard fought, hard won, and a significant accomplishment. So I think it was a good day for the city.
So I'm guessing most people that are listening in it's clear now that conserving older and historic neighborhoods in LA is a challenge, in part by long-time limitation and constraints in terms of our available tools. And I think that's the point we want to shift to. And the last point in terms of our conversation here is about how that's changing. So very briefly, the last tool we want to highlight is a part of zoning and land use, which in planning is perhaps one of the biggest problems with teardowns and mansionization, is most zoning codes across the country are greatly outdated, many from the 1950s era when our vision for our communities were much different than today, and they are driving and incentivizing teardowns, and few places have addressed this particular problem through a comprehensive rewrite of zoning. So Los Angeles is fortunate here in terms of, as it's currently updating its 1946 zoning code as part of the Recode LA effort, includes new single-family zoning classifications that are context-specific, and they're looking to other places like Austin and Denver and others that have done similar things to this, like form-based coding that is much more trying to reinforce the existing contexts. The neighborhoods that were included in the interim control ordinance, as I mentioned, some are on their way to becoming historic preservation overlay zones. The rest of them, the majority of those, are getting new single family, what they're calling variation zones. Currently, 19 neighborhoods are expected to get the new specialized zoning before the end of the month. With about 70% of single family neighborhoods using the R1 zone, these 19 are the first to receive this new type of zoning in the city. And rather than a standard one-size-fits-all R1 single-family classification, which is what we've had up until now, that often doesn't control building massing, the new R1 variation zones offer the ability to tailor zoning and a range of tools to combine context and policy together. Some R1 zones will be more restrictive than others. The idea is to offer the right zone for your neighborhood so new houses in the future will reflect and respond to the existing context and character of a neighborhood. The variation zones include bulk and encroachment planes as well as setbacks to curtail the overall massing and provide for increased light and air on neighboring properties. Some of the same things are within the BMO BHO. Further, if your neighborhood has predominantly rear garages, as we mentioned before, the variation zone will take that into account and require you to build a rear detached garage rather than at the front of the house. Hillside neighborhoods, especially in Los Angeles and other cities, it's a big issue, and their unique issues are also being addressed. which range from steep slopes that are buildable by right to zero setbacks and substandard streets. So there's elements that are being addressed within the new recode there as well. This is still very early in terms of the recode process, and I would encourage you to check out the Recode LA website. There's a lot of details there that they posted, and more to come as this rolls out. But that's our main pitch in terms of teardowns and mansionization in broad strokes and how it's worked in LA. I think ultimately teardowns and mansionization is all about deciding what you want your older and historic neighborhood to look like in the future, and from a community character perspective. It's having people come together to truly consider all the short-term gains as well as factoring in the long-term implications that come with teardowns and mansionization. And I think hopefully it's clear in terms of the presentation and certainly Shelley's comments that there is no easy, quick, or single fix for this issue in any city. So it's often a long-term approach and testing out a variety of tools to try to make it work. But I think at this point, we're going to turn it back over to John and try to answer any questions that you all have. I think looks like we have about 15 minutes or so still. So.
Okay, great timing, and thank you both for a wonderful presentation. I don't currently see any questions, but I think I'll kick it off. We have about 35 people in the room here today, and we want to make sure that we address all of your questions, so please do type any questions you have in the chat box or the Q&A box. Also, before you leave today, please leave feedback on the survey link that I've provided in the chat box. I will also be emailing that link out, but we do encourage you to leave feedback for us. I think what I'll start with from my end is a question about how to convince our elected leaders and anybody else the benefits of having these types of ordinances. And I know you sort of alluded to it a bit in the presentation, but how does the environment play into this? What sort of impacts do larger structures like these 6,000 square foot structures have on both our carbon output and any impact on the environment that you think could be used as sort of an argument? And is there any way that historic preservationists or people who are involved in trying to curtail mansionization in their community could partner with environmental groups?
I'll start. It's definitely an approach that some communities have taken on this, where they haven't even looked at it from a design or preservation perspective at all. It's all about environmental impacts and sustainability. Some communities have charted the amount of demolition debris that comes through this practice. Again, what many consider a wasteful loss of perfectly good housing, but what's the impact on the environment? And some have suggested, I'm not sure if any have implemented quite yet, tipping fees or, based on the amount of demolition that you're incurring through this. Others have done it around tree ordinances, loss of, mature trees, cover, those kinds of elements. So, I think there's a variety of ways to make your case around teardowns. It doesn't have to be just about the loss of historic buildings, and it depends on what your perspective is. But there may be other approaches that might resonate more in a community than others.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent question, because there are certainly some decision makers who are much more swayed by and much more attuned to the environmental issues. So some of the points to make are that teardowns turn houses into debris. They consume massive amounts of material, and they guzzle energy for the foreseeable future. So they definitely have a negative effect in terms of environment, or what I think a lot of cities are looking at more broadly as sustainability. And in fact, I have thought of it as a sustainability issue really on two levels. One being essentially the carbon footprint, but the other being the issues of the character of a neighborhood and the interaction of the community.
You still there, John?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so maybe I'll follow up with another question as well, because I don't see any other questions coming in quite yet. But as you were discussing the process of adopting a baseline Mansionization ordinance, I was also thinking of the possibility of ballot initiatives and whether that's ever been considered as an option. I know that the ordinance process is probably the more direct route, but has that ever been considered as an option if that doesn't work out for your group?
I'm not aware of any of those. I mean, it's so specific, and you know, Los Angeles just as of yesterday, you know, had a series of ballots, including one that would affect planning in a big way that failed. But I'm not aware of any examples of that where they try to get at the Mansionization teardown issue through a ballot initiative.
I would say that it sounds, well, this is probably something of a generality, but it's hard enough to explain what a floor area ratio is. It doesn't strike me as an issue that really lends itself readily to a ballot initiative, or rather I would say that it would lend itself all too readily to being very much demagogued and misrepresented.
Great. We did have somebody raise their hands. Brad has raised his hand, so I'm going to unmute him right now. Hopefully this works. Looks like he's not connected to a microphone. So Brad, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box or the chat box. The other question I'll have while we're waiting for any other that might potentially come in is about outreach strategies, how to mobilize support, and what have you found is most helpful in getting people mobilized around this issue and getting them to contact their elected officials and so forth?
Well, honestly, the thing that's most effective is when the first McMansion shows up in the neighborhood. There's just nothing like that to take it from conceptual and distant to tangible and immediate. Beyond that, I guess I would say that one of the things that you do want to bear in mind, or at least that we had to, was to be a little bit selective about whom we recruited, because you kind of have to know your audiences. In Los Angeles, there are a lot of homeowners associations, there are a lot of neighborhood councils, there are many, many groups that you might want to bring in, but once you get them to take a vote, you're stuck with that vote. So do a little homework and find out, is this a group that there's a reasonable likelihood that they will be sympathetic and helpful, or are you going to be asking for something that you maybe don't want to live with?
Okay, and it looks like, Brad, you might be activated now, I'm guessing. It looks like you're not muted anymore. Did you have a question?
Yes, one of our commissioners, Deborah Martin, has a question for you here.
Yes, thank you. My question is, isn't there a more simplistic way to do this? What I was envisioning in the past is in neighborhoods that only have one-story housing, why can't we make an ordinance for the city that if it's a one-story neighborhood, that it has to stay consistent to one stories? And I would just think that would be so simple about this whole Mansionization.
So I'll start. Some communities have done just that. It is, like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and some can be much more simple in terms of dealing with it. it usually isn't just an issue of, single story versus multi-story. There usually are other aspects associated with teardowns that can be an issue that you want to get at. But certainly controlling the height or the number of stories in a specified neighborhood because that doesn't match the character, that is certainly something that communities have done. Or they've done it prohibiting 2 stories with exceptions that maybe you can only do the 2-story addition in the rear half of the property, and maybe there's some type of design review for that aspect. And this is an issue that we've seen, especially in some post-war neighborhoods where, it's ranch houses, and that's the characteristic that is important to maintain, and putting in kind of a pseudo neoclassical, house really doesn't fit. So that's where they've addressed it in terms of the number of stories that could be allowed and the exceptions to that rule.
And one more thing, in the city of Pomona, we have a historic ordinance that any house over 50 years old has to go through the Historic Commission for approval of a tear down. So anyhow, does Los Angeles have that ordinance?
No, it does not. It would, there's 880,000 parcels in the city of Los Angeles, so that type of trigger doesn't exist in terms of just staff time and review. I think it's great that Pomona has it, because that's part of it, is having some type of early understanding and review of this before you know what you're losing.
Yes, and we've been able to save quite a few structures because of this ordinance. So, and we do have 3 historic districts too. But I want to thank you. I just wanted to share those little informational. Oh, there you are, right there. I'm sorry. Anyway, I don't know if any of my other historic commissioners that are here in the room. Okay, just one second. I think we do have some more questions. Just one second. Go ahead, take over.
What communities? They mentioned other communities. What communities? Have the 1-story. Yeah.
Oh, do you know what other communities have the 1-story limitation?
I don't know offhand, but when I was at the National Trust, I was tracking some of that, so I might be able to get my hands on some examples for you that we're happy to follow up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions from Pomona, I'm going to close your screen share here. One second here. There was another question that came into the Q&A box, and the question was, have neighborhood councils been educated about the issue of mansionization?
I think that's Gail. Hi, Gail. I think every neighborhood council in Los Angeles is pretty aware of this issue. I think some are more concerned than others, but I think Shelley would be better first to answer that question.
Right. No, I think that the issue is relatively high profile after all that has passed here, and most neighborhood councils are aware of it. The level of engagement is certainly not uniform because some of them, for example, serve mostly neighborhoods that wouldn't be affected directly by the issue. In any case, they're maybe mostly multifamily housing and so forth. And let me just touch on that point very briefly as well, to say that one of the things, the arguments that I think has been helpful in terms of building a broad base is that the reform of the single family zones sets a firm foundation and sets a precedent for a lot of issues that are going to follow in its wake that do directly affect multifamily neighborhoods and so forth. So when you're working to build support, you may want to make sure that you touch on that as well, that it's not just a very specific problem. And the affordability issue, certainly in Los Angeles, is a very, very important point to address.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. We are 4 minutes out to 1:30, which gives us a few minutes for any final questions you may have. So this is your last chance. Other than that, a second time, I'm going to encourage you to please click on the survey link to take the survey for today's session and let us know what you think. I send the summary to our speakers. And wanted also to thank you for joining our third webinar this year. We have plenty of more programs planned the rest of the year, so visit our website if you're interested in attending more webinars in the future. Members get a special discount, and also encourage you to come to our conference this year, which is in Pasadena. It's the 40th anniversary of both Pasadena Heritage and the California Preservation Foundation. And the theme for this year's conference is Preservation at the Forefront. So we hope you'll join us there. And one final thank you to Adrian and Shelley for their time and their wonderful presentations today. If there are no further questions, I'm going to leave the screen on, but I'm going to turn off the sound for everyone. And the screen will be up another 5 minutes or so for you to take the survey. Thanks again for your time, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.